So with that in mind, without any further ado, would you help me and welcome me, Dr. Charles Davis.
Appreciate you, brother. Don't need more than one hot mic, I think. Let's see. Good morning, technically. I think we have 1 minute until it's afternoon, but good morning and good afternoon. Good morning and good afternoon. There we go. There we go. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to engage with you all today. When Reggie reached out, it was an interesting outreach in the sense that typically, as a faculty member here, you get asked to present on your academic work and the things that you're kind of researching or things that you're teaching about. But Reggie was really pointed in asking me to talk a bit about my artistic practice, which has both been in concert and in tension with the academic work that I've pursued at the early part of my career, and a little bit less so now, but we'll talk a bit about that. And so as I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I was drawn, of course, obviously, given the moment in which we find ourselves, Black History Month, which, of course, we know was founded by Carter G. Woodson in 1926, that started officially as Negro History Week. It was recognized as Negro History Week in part because Black communities were already celebrating the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, which occurred on February 12th and February 14th, respectively. Subsequently, in 1970, it was actually Black student organizers at Kent State University who celebrated the first month-long recognition of Black History Month, and it was not until 1976 that the U.S. federal government actually took on a recognition of a month-long celebration of Black history. So that was sort of a starting point in thinking about our conversation today. But I also thought about what it meant to engage in Black expression, right? Both in the academic sense, but also in the artistic sense. And then sort of this idea, this notion that I've been engaging with called the Black Quotidian. And so for those who are perhaps less familiar, the Quotidian simply refers to the everyday, right? And the interstitial ways in which we think about Blackness and the concept of this ongoing work that I'll speak a bit more about. And so I'm hoping that in addition to sort of me presenting a bit of that, we can also engage in a conversation about what these things might mean for you. So I think it's always helpful to kind of go back to the beginning. And these are two pictures of me when I was a baby, obviously. I've grown a lot since then, I think in the 40 years since these photos. I do. And so you can see my father here and my mother off camera in the other space. But I reference these photos a lot more now as someone who's come into fatherhood over the last 5 years. And I see and think about the ways in which my parents now are retired, sort of in that twilight part of their life, the things they prioritize, the things that they value, the things that bring them joy. And I think it's so important as we think about who we are in this academic context that we don't lose sight of who we are and to whom we belong. And so these pictures are often reminders of thinking about what it means to be in relationship and be in community, rather than in isolation and pursuing individual desires, which the academy often prefers and rewards. And so in thinking about that, I think it's helpful to start out with how I think about my own story. And so I start this by saying that mine is the story of a boy who spent his summers becoming Black in Alabama, wrestling dirt in the whispering winds of Wetumpka out back of a one-room shack in which his great-grandmother raised 15 children. Mine is the story of a boy who spent time with an old man, fishing the broken bakes of Birmingham and riding a tractor in the tattered town of Tuskegee, only to learn years later that that old man was not indeed his grandfather. It is also the story of a school teacher and Army colonel's firstborn, who as a child was taught being Black in an anti-Black world meant I had to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so it was with these set of sensibilities of being and becoming a university professor, guaranteed to give you more, not the lesser, that the improbable became inevitable. And so much has happened, obviously, again, since this particular point in time. I was able to navigate schooling in a particular way. My mother was an English teacher for 25 years and spent the latter part of her career as a guidance counselor. My grandmother was a librarian in San Antonio, Texas. And so when Reggie talks about me being a third-generation educator, that's sort of where I ground myself in thinking about my teaching practice and the things that they imposed upon me in that particular moment. So I was able to attend college. I went to Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. There, I was a member of the drumline and was in the marching band That was probably the primary reason that I ended up going to that particular school, but found very quickly, right, as a black person in a white Southern predominantly environment, having grown up in the South, I knew what it was, as we say, right? And so thankfully, Florida A&M University right there was a tremendous resource for me, but also the resources that we were able to garner, much like the black students here, through our Black Student Union, which is a big part of my life, and also becoming a member of the greatest fraternity before God and man, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. I see y'all got the black and gold plates. That's all our good brother that y'all can have that for today, but me and Reggie gonna make some changes for next year. And so part of that rooting in Florida becomes really important, right? So I'm able to subsequently go on to graduate school, pursue a master's degree, well, my second master's, so Kanye's master's at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm transitioning from communications to education as a field, and subsequently go to the University of Arizona to pursue a PhD in education. And in my second year, something very life-changing happens. Trayvon Martin is murdered by George Zimmerman in Sanford, Florida. And specifically, we understand Trayvon Martin's story as a black boy who was simply visiting his father, going to a nearby gas station to get some Skittles and an iced tea, and walking his way back in a gated community, and ultimately to watch the All-Star game. And part of why that resonated with me, not unlike President Obama's articulation in the wake of Trayvon's murder, right, is he said that black boy could have been my son. And for me, I understood that Trayvon could have also been me. As a black boy who grew up in a gated community in Florida, who was presumed to be in a place that he was not welcome, nor did he belong. Often questioned and stopped, surveilled, right? I could easily have been in that same situation. But even more eerily, it was reminiscent of the murder of a boy named Martin Lee Anderson, who was killed in 2006, my senior year of college, in a Bay Area boot camp by guards at that boot camp that were ultimately exonerated for his death. And so it was very similar to a thing that I'd experienced, things that we had organized around, and ultimately those who ultimately founded the Dream Defenders, which is the sort of preeminent organization that predates the beginning of Black Lives Matter, organized to find justice for Trayvon Martin and his family. And so this radicalized me in a particular kind of way. As someone who had very deep ties to Florida, but was in Arizona, a world away, trying to get this graduate school thing done, I needed to figure out how I could engage and locate myself within a burgeoning movement. And so I began writing pretty widely about what the Dream Defenders were doing. And at some point, the chair of our department said, like, Charles, I know you have this plan for your dissertation. Like, why aren't you studying this stuff? Like, this is what you care about. This is what you spend all your time doing. You're organizing students here at Arizona. Why isn't this the thing you study? Now, selfishly, he was a sociologist, and so he was very much steeped in the canon of social movement theory. And so he put me through a one-year intensive of engaging with the literature in that particular way, so I could kind of find myself, right, and sort of reconcile these two otherwise disparate parts of me as an academic and researcher, pursuing things that had value maybe within my field of study, but maybe had less value to me personally. And so at that point, I decided I'm going to do my dissertation on the Dream Defenders. I'm going to understand how they're using digital and social media as a part of their organizing practice, and what young people more generally were using to mobilize resources to pursue their movement goals. And later did I sort of understand, when I came into graduate school, I was funded by a grant from the Gates Foundation that was trying to understand how social media could be leveraged as learning communities, particularly in community colleges. And the person with whom I started working knew a lot about higher education and community colleges, didn't know anything about social media. I was working in advertising at the time before I was going to pursue back in graduate school. And so it was sort of a perfect storm of things that only years later would become my ability to understand how social media works, my desires to continue to pursue an intellectual interest in education, and my work as an organizer would converge into what would become my dissertation study, but really shaped an important way how I thought about my involvement in the movement. Now, I think this is important in part because as intellectuals, as academics, the mind space that we often can take up in a room, right, and the air that we can suck out of it as a consequence of our presence, can do very detrimental things in a movement space, right? And so what I was able to learn very quickly by being in community with the Dream Defenders is that although that could be a thing that I could offer, right, I could provide strategy and direction and think about tactics, I was actually more useful as somebody working with the communications folks. Right? And so I found sort of a home with what they called the comms mafia at the time for Dream Defenders, with some young people who were working, sort of developing their media program. And I realized, like, oh, this is a space where I can make, I think, a meaningful contribution, and started becoming a documentarian of the movement. And so what you see here is sort of a collage of my first installation of what's known as the longitudinal depictions of student organized resistance. And this is some work that we presented some years ago, but this is from protests at a variety of places. A lot of what you see here is in Philly, but we have stuff from Miami, stuff from Jackson, Mississippi, stuff from Florida as well, over across the first parts of this series. And I think that's what really encouraged me to think about art in a way that could connect to my academic work, but also into the things that were most important for us as Black people happening at the time. And so there are some other things evolutionarily that happened that kind of moved me even closer to this artist space that I'll talk about now. So the first is that I met my wife, Brooke. We actually met when I was in graduate school in Arizona, slid into some DMs, won't say who did who to what at that particular moment, but got acquainted, had a lot of, similar friends. She's originally from Philadelphia, and so we knew a lot of the same people, but she was a model and commercial actress. And part of my developed sort of artistically outside of the movement space was supporting her in her effort and her career and doing her work. And so these are two photos I took when we lived in Los Angeles. But I think speak to how she kind of pushed me to think about, developing my art in a different kind of way. Because like I had this camera, there were things that she needed, things that I wanted to explore that she just really encouraged me to kind of like lean into. And so I had the, really just the pleasure to continue to work with her and to be creative partners with her in so many of the things that we do together, which has been a really binding thing within our relationship, as well as our intellectual interests beginning to develop and emerge. Subsequent to that, we had two kids, one of which is actually turned 5 today. Freedom is 5 years old today, and Justice is 18 months. And so when I think about the idea of that Black quotient, about that everydayness, that's something that started rooted in movement work, started in community, built into relationship with my wife, actually allows me to think about an expression for my son and my daughter, I was able to take these photos. Because naturally, as a photographer, as an artist, like anybody else taking these damn photos of my babies, like it's gonna be me, right? That's what daddy's gonna do. But I'm so thankful for all of these steps that happened that allowed for me to engage in this practice. Really in an informal way, right? Like I didn't go to art school, don't have an MFA. I kind of engaged in the YouTube University's version of study, and then also being an academic, I knew to go to the literature, right, and to look up some folks who I'll talk about a bit later. So this is Freedom and Justice when they were babies, doing similar pictures, both of which are hanging in our house, and we've been to their grandparents and godparents and all that. So I want to transition a bit to just talk about sort of the study side of the artistic practice. And so I want to read this quote. After emancipation, all those people who had been slaves, they needed the music more than ever now. It was like they were trying to find out in this music what they were supposed to do with freedom. Playing the music and listening to it, waiting for it to express what they needed to learn. Once they had learned it, wasn't just white people the music had to reach, but straight out of life and what a man does with his life when it's finally his. So this is a quote from saxophonist and clarinetist Sidney Bechet from 1960 in a piece that's quoted by the other person I'm going to talk about here, Elizabeth Catlett. And I draw on both of them as folks who philosophically kind of inform the way that I think about art and the role of the Black artist, and particularly in the context of what it means to do this, not for the white gaze or not for the art establishment, right, but something that speaks to this process of what Jaleel Mustafa Bishop calls Black life making. And so Elizabeth Catlett was a Black American and Mexican sculptor and graphic artist who was especially known for her depictions of Black American experience in the 20th century, which really focused on Black women's experiences. And so she both used sculpting and this other graphic medium with just some really beautiful images. She moved to Mexico in 1946 and ended up staying there for like 20 years, became a chair of an art department there, and very much came into relationship with the Mexican community there, which of course also included Black Mexicans. And in her piece in The Black Scholar in 1975, when she talks about the role of the Black artist, she writes, "What Black artists are in search of is means, the how-to, the whereby of reaching the mass of Black people through their art." And this stood out to me for a variety of reasons, but the least of which is as a Black academic and intellectual in a white institution, right? I'm constantly confronted with the question of what does this mean for Black people, right? What does it mean to give access and entree to Black people, many of whom are disenfranchised from access to this space, right? We know that Black students have for many years been relegated to 4% of this institution. Black faculty are about the same. And so I think often as a publicly engaged scholar, what does it mean to take the work outside and beyond the academy, right, to places that it's actually in desperate need that could actually affect the material conditions of everyday Black people. And so as I started making sense of those things, again, it came back to this notion of what is the everydayness of Black people and Blackness. As someone who has moved around a lot, there were certain common things that I could see in places like Arizona that were not dissimilar from what was happening in Wetumpka, Alabama, that was not dissimilar from what was happening on 127th and 3rd, where I lived in Harlem. And so there's something about that everyday interstitial way that Blackness manifested that just kept speaking to me that I just wanted to document. And so I will present to you, which has not yet been released to the public, a short trailer for a project that will be coming out shortly.
Black. Black. Black, black, black. Black on black, black. Yeah. Hey. Okay, black, 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 black on black, black, my thoughts so black, 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 I'm black, my skin is so black, I'm rocking that black on black is black.
Black rims on this
Black.
black wheels in this black
Black.
wheel with this
Black.
black bitch.
Black.
So black on black on black on black on
Black.
Thank you. You don't have to clap, but it makes me feel good.
Black.
So again, this notion of the Black Quotidian, something I kept coming back to, and it's the title of the first in a series of books that I hope to release, negotiating some things with legal and IP right now that's throwing us a little bit off. But really what it needs to be depicting everydayness of Black life making against the rising tide of an anti-Black world. And I think that becomes so much more pressing at this moment, right? As we think about the constant threats to life making in general, but especially to Black life making by this administration, right? And those who would rather see us not only not be in these places, but not even be alive. And what does it mean to, as we go back to Bichette's sort of thinking, right? Of when the life is ours, what do we make of it? And then how is art so important to that, right? How culture production and life making are intertwined. We were just having a really, thoughtful conversation earlier about literacy and what it means to have been a people disenfranchised from literacy, coming into literacy, but now in a moment in which these types of modalities allow for other literacies to be sense-making opportunities for students, right? And so part of this is an expression in this particular text, which includes, at least in the first volume, pictures I've taken from 2014 to 2016, that my wife was said, look, you've just been like sitting on this stuff. Like, why are you sitting on it? It needs to see the light of day. The world needs to see it. And as we know, hard drives fail, those things end up going away. And then you've done all that for what? And so I was able to put this collection together, partly as a commitment to myself. I'm going up for tenure in the fall, and that has its own sort of, situations to deal with. But in this moment, doing the academic exercise is not fulfilling, right, in the way that I need it to be. It doesn't keep me in right relationship and closer to my people. It doesn't remind me of my humanity. If anything, it takes much of that away. And so this is a particular expression of that. And so I'll just go through a couple of the photos that are in the series. And so this photo is of a good friend of mine, Matt Nelson, who is an artist himself, also a brilliant scholar in his own right, who actually left pursuit of the academy in order to pursue his art full time. There were things that he understood that he liked. He liked being near water and warmth, being with his friends and making music. And so he moved to Puerto Rico after graduate school, and like that's just what he's been doing for the last several years. But he and I worked together. We did my first documentary together entitled American Matthew, Vignette of a Patriot, that was about his own reconciliation of the post-verdict after George Zimmerman was exonerated, and the art that he made and be able to document that process, interview him later. But this picture, surprisingly, is actually one of the very first pictures I ever took. I took it at 2014 at South by Southwest as we were stumbling through the streets in Austin, Texas. And for those who are familiar with the series Boondocks, right, it was getting re-released in 2014. And so there was this guerrilla marketing campaign. And coincidentally, like that's just how Matt looked at the time. And he walked by the mural. I'm like, bro, like, fuck, like you stop, go back, just like do the whole thing. I just took the picture. Exposure is probably all off, and like all these things are not fine-tuned, but there's just an aesthetic that is speaking to it. And we all are familiar with this idea of art imitating life, right? And so this one's entitled Imitation, where it's actually like the life that I'm seeing and engaging with at that moment is being imitated by this particular art in this silhouette form. And so it's just like this big, massive mural. And so as I was talking about sort of the IP negotiations, right, this is the thing we're trying to figure out is like, well, like, is it the muralist? Is it Aaron Magruder? Is it Sony? Like, who owns the thing? Is it a problem? I'm trying to figure that out now. But I say this in part that there was a thing that I saw on the internet recently of this idea that like, you just have to make things exist. Like you can make them good later. And part of what I was able to do in this particular moment was like, just do the thing without worrying or knowing enough about how to do it the correct way. Right. And so I really just appreciate this as a reminder. And also it's like a really dope ass picture, if I say so myself, right. That you can just do things. You don't need permission. Right. And sometimes your doing also gives people permission to do the thing that they want to do. Going back to some of that sort of movement influence, these are two from the Black DNC rally in Philadelphia a bunch of years ago in 2016. One of a sister with a collar, it says, "I'm not sorry." I think this is around the same time that Lemonade came out, give or take a bit. And then another sister's just like on the picket line as they're moving forward. But I just really appreciate these two particular portraits and images. One, when we think about the important and irreplaceable role of Black women in Black freedom struggles, right? And particularly at a moment that's in the 2 years at the beginning of Black Lives Matter, and the work of Opal, of Alicia Garza, of Patrisse Cullors, in that sort of generation of that movement frame. Next is a series entitled Crowns. And so this series just kind of manifested. I was doing some event photography for a Get Out to Vote project called Black and Engaged around 2016 around the same time. And there was a lot of circles and conversations as people were trying to figure out how do we mobilize folks, right, in this particular moment to get out to vote. And I found myself like behind a lot of people for some reason. And as we know, like Black hair and sort of the aesthetic of hair is like a very important part of our tradition. And so what started off as something that, again, like wasn't necessarily planned. I think I took an accidental picture where the focus wasn't on the person in front, it was on the actual foreground. And so then I just started taking like hella pictures of the back of people's heads. And it kind of felt like a barbershop or a salon. If you're ever in a back barbershop salon, right, there's like the thing, there's a number, it's the one that you want and the one that mama says you have to get, right? It felt very reminiscent of sort of like the Black barbershop or Black salon, of like all these different styles and textures, none of which were, you know, right or wrong, they just existed. And so what started as a collection of some in a specific location emerged into some in some other locations, which you can see with some of the, you know, discontinuity and uniformity. But I just love this as like an expression of Blackness that if you see it, like you immediately just know, right? Like these are us. And so I originally pitched it to a magazine that ultimately like decided not to publish it, which is like fine, right? But the fact that it just ended up holding on and evolving, there's probably 30 or 40 more images that are like this that are done in this particular collection, which is featured in a spread. So then as I also think about Black light making and everydayness, and we're going to wrap up here pretty soon for Q&A, it's also about location. So as a Black person who has moved tremendously throughout my life, my father, again, was in the military. We moved 13 times in 18 years as I was growing up. And for whatever reason, I've kept that occupation as I've been into adulthood, having moved pretty significantly and surprisingly, which I don't know if it's like a plus or a minus. We'll have to go to the Black scorecard later. Like Ann Arbor is actually one of the longest places I've lived, like singularly, right? And of course, we can talk about Black, you know, Ann Arbor and its history and the marginalization of Black folks in Michigan too. But I think about place a lot, right? And Blackness is where you are, right? It's when you are. And so much of what it means to be Black is sometimes circumscribed by those geospatial relations. And so this to me was just like a very hallmark picture. Again, a really, you know, early picture in my career, I guess, of 2015. And I was actually visiting my, you know, girlfriend at the time, but now wife. And, you know, just Black boy just sitting here waiting for the train, right? And so much of what New York was for me and like Philly was for me was just like seeing all these everyday sort of ways that people are navigating and getting through. And so I really appreciated this picture because also like it's not common you have a single person on a platform on the train, but you know, Brooklyn trains, if you've lived in New York, you know, like the train in Brooklyn is hit or miss, and sometimes it comes, sometimes it don't come. You know, when we just found ourselves at this particular moment, and some of my homeboys lived at this particular stop, and they called themselves the Halsey Boys. So it was interesting that there was like a boy at the Halsey stop just sitting here in this particular moment. And so the last thing that I would talk about is this particular series. So again, so I mentioned Philadelphia, went to grad school there, met my wife actually in Brooklyn, but she ended up being from there, spent a lot of time there, early part of my career was there. And if you know anything about like Black folks in urban community, right? Like wherever there's water in the summer, we're gonna be, right? Whether that's the hydrant, or in this case, this is Dilworth Park, which is actually right outside of City Hall in Philadelphia. And there were just like loads of like Black families and folks there. And part of this too, right, is the lack of access to like municipal pools, right? So we can have a whole conversation about that too. And you would just see just like this immense amount of joy, right? Mostly with children, because now that I have small children, I understand like parents is going through it, trying to figure out this water situation at Dilworth Park. But we had a beautiful set of things that, again, I was just taking pictures and didn't really sort through until later. One of just, when I think about this idea, what I call like mother-sister, I don't know these two folks' specific relationship, right? But I know, given where I am sort of in my life, that I have figures who operate both sort of in this maternal sort of way, but also in this sibling kind of way, depending on how proximal we are in our age. But also I understand caretaking, really what it means to engage with the village, what it means to have a lot of people who are invested in your family in the caretaking. And this just felt like a very tender moment that we could like sort of capture. That again, I didn't even know until I started putting this book together that I had this specific one. And then this other set here are just 3 expressions of Black children doing things that Black children should be able to do, right? In a moment in which Black children have been persecuted for otherwise doing. If this hadn't been such a common practice, say there had been like one Black family at this particular fountain, so to a lot of them, I'm sure Philadelphia PD would have been there telling them to go, right? And yet, and still, in the face of that uncertainty, in the face of that precarity, Black people are just living their lives, right? And so you have a boy who's running in a sprinkler on sort of like one hand, and I have a beautiful series of just that particular one at the top. And I love this one of the little girl who's just like, I'm just here for the sun. Like I'm just out here laying around having a great time, right? And to me, that communicates this notion of why rest becomes so important, right? And we can debate the semantics of rest being revolutionary later, right? And then this one where he's just really going after it, right? And also because their faces aren't pictured, which is, sort of a politics of the medium thing of how do you negotiate that, particularly with small children. But it could be anybody and it could be everybody. And I think that is the thing that spoke to me, going back to that sort of first picture that I showed. And if you look up the American Matthew series, when the art piece that he has is a flag that he bought at a thrift store in Philly. And so, Philly, birth of the democracy, blah, 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 bullshit. Right. But, you can imagine there's a ton of flags that are just available from different parts of that history. And also, like, people just collect flags in Philadelphia. So he bought like an older flag that I think had 48 stars on it still. And he said, and he talks about this in the interview, he said, when the verdict came down for the Zimmerman trial, the flag just became too much to bear. And it was hanging in my room, and so I decided to change it. And what he ended up doing, and he asked me, he said, hey, can you give me like all the names of like unarmed Black men and boys who've been killed by police? And I was like, I guess, sure. So I'm on this sort of archival mission, and I'm able to come up with, incomplete list of names that start relatively early. We're talking about Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, like very early sort of stages. And it ends with Trayvon, obviously. We have a homie where his closer friends, Robbie Tolan, who was shot in Texas. But it ends with Trayvon. And in the last space, it's just blank. It's just an underline. And I was like, oh, like, why did you, like, dude, what's that for? He's like, because it could literally just be any of us. When Trayvon got killed, it was just the news. And that's always stuck with me, right? That it can be any of us. It can be all of us. And I think that is especially important, and I'll close here. When I think about the role of the Black academic, of the Black artist, first and foremost, the role is to do right by Black people. Is to see yourself as a part of that community, not separate from it, right? It's to see yourself not as something that's excellent outside of the context of what it means to be in community. And so much of what these places will try to give you and try to tell you, right, is that you're excellent because you were the first Black person to get tenure in your department, and will tell you nothing about all the people that were denied, right? And at the moment at which you believe that these institutions love you is the exact moment in which they will betray you, and they will cast you out, and they will discard you. They will disabuse themselves of having any responsibility for your upkeep and for your well-being. And so for me, when I think about that in conversation then with Joy James and Edmund T. Gordon's work and what they write about and what it means to have community outside of the academy, it becomes so important. And sort of how I've theorized about that is that if we fail to engage with community outside of the academy, if and when these places burn down, literally or figuratively, and the way the federal government's moving at present, right, you will have no one to call neighbor, and you will have no place to call home. And so for me, when I think about then what it means to engage in this practice, it's a sort of sense of homegoing. It's a sort of sense of placemaking. It's a sort of sense of writing my relationship with a community that the academy has tried to socialize me away from. And so I will leave you with that, and thank you all for just letting me experiment and talk with you, and I look forward to Q&A and more conversation. So thank you.